To those of us watching from Asia, good morning. And to everyone else from all around the world, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Vignesh, and I am from the HED Foundation. And today, I have the pleasure and the honor of moderating what I hope and believe will be an enriching, exciting, and enlightening discussion about the future of higher education in our region, in Southeast Asia. The HED Foundation, established in 2013, is a charitable foundation committed to the sustainable development of Southeast Asia and beyond. We support various research and intervention initiatives across the region that look to improve the lives of the people in Southeast Asia through education and quality healthcare. Beyond supporting projects, we also run capacity building programs for educators and for school leaders across Southeast Asia. And one of our most interesting projects in the HED Foundation is our publications. We hope that through our publications, we're able to share knowledge, the latest insights with researchers, with practitioners, and with thought leaders across Southeast Asia. We invite academics, researchers, thought leaders to publish and to share their perspectives with us through our flagship publications, Think and HESB. Today, it is with great pleasure and honor that I get to share with you our latest publication and issue of HESB, our 10th special and commemorative issue. This 10th issue will look not just at the state of higher education across Southeast Asia, but also share the perspectives of policymakers, thought leaders, academics, and practitioners on the trajectories and the future of higher education in each of the 11 Southeast Asian countries. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me share with you a short video that explains the thinking behind HESB and shares a little bit more details about this, our special issue.
Through our focus on education and healthcare, the HED Foundation aims to help improve the lives of people in Southeast Asia and beyond. We design and deliver sustainable capacity building programs, support and fund research, and share knowledge through our events and publications. Higher education in Southeast Asia and beyond, or HESB, is one of our flagship publications, featuring opinions and commentaries from experts on important and contemporary topics in higher education.
As a result of my doctoral research on higher education, I've always felt that there was a need for a publication that focused on higher education in the region, one that would discuss the latest policies and developments, and two, serve as a platform for sharing best ideas and best practices. And when I joined the HED Foundation in 2015, I thought, how can the foundation help a new generation of scholars who are building up higher education systems in their own countries? HESB is the answer to that question.
Over the last 9 issues, HESB has covered some of today's most pressing issues in higher education, such as internationalization, massification, sustainability, and student mobility. Understanding the important role HESB plays in facilitating the sharing of ideas, the HED Foundation, in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, published a special issue in 2020. This special issue featured insights from university leaders on how they were navigating the crisis, while others shared their perspectives on the reforms needed to make higher education more relevant and resilient. Today, we are proud to announce the launch of our commemorative 10th issue. We have invited leading researchers and policymakers to comment on the trajectory of higher education in each of the 11 Southeast Asian countries. You will also find the latest available data such as gross enrollment rates, the amount of higher education spending, and the number of foreign students, which would be a useful reference for specialists and the public alike.
As HESB moves into the future, we want it to continue to being the platform for leading thinkers to share their opinions, thoughts and experiences which will benefit higher education institutions in the region as they become better at what they do.
We invite you to explore the illuminating and thought-provoking articles in our HESB issues. They're available for free on our website.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you take the opportunity to visit our website and download the latest issue of HESB. You'll also find on our website past issues of HESB together with our other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, let us move into today's webinar. The webinar entitled State of Higher Education in the Region. In a McKinsey report in 2013, it was found that ASEAN, if it was a combined economy, would be the 7th largest economy in the world. And it predicted that by 2050, ASEAN would be the 4th largest economy in the world. ASEAN has also one of the youngest populations in the world right now. We look to China and India to be drivers of the global economic growth in the coming century, but ASEAN has a critical role to play. As a region, it is diverse, it is different. There's so many languages spoken across Southeast Asia, there's so many religions practiced, cultures, histories that are long and storied right across the region. But yet it is a region that, if it comes together, is critically important to the global economic development. So in today's discussion, we want to hear from our esteemed panelists and speakers about where this is going to lead. As Southeast Asia takes its place as one of the world's key economic drivers, what is going to be the state of education, and specifically higher education? As economies grow and develop, the demand for well-trained, highly skilled labor will certainly increase. And higher education institutions have an important role to play in providing that labor. But is that all a higher education institution is? Is it there to provide the labor that is needed by the economy? Or is it there to mold and shape the minds of future leaders, to open them to new perspectives and ideas that could transform not just their countries, but the region, and possibly even the world? Will we be getting thought leaders from Southeast Asia who will be determining economic models that the world will adopt in the coming century? Well, we hope that we can unpack some of these and other issues in our discussions today. But let me now introduce our panelists, followed by our keynote speaker for today's webinar. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Dr. Morshidi Sirat. Professor Morshidi Sirat is currently the Honorary Professor at University Science Malaysia. Prior to this, he was the founding director of the Commonwealth Tertiary Education Facility. Professor Morshidi has served the Ministry of Higher Education in Malaysia as its Director General of Higher Education. Joining Professor Morshidi on the panel is Dr. Adrian Kwah. Dr. Adrian Kwah is an interesting man, and he gave me two CVs to read. So I'm going to read the one that Dr. Kwah prepared. Adrian Kwah has a type of CV that makes the typical Singaporean parent throw up their hands in despair. He's a recovering civil servant twice over and has been an academic twice over too. Along the way, he was an investment banker, worked in an economic consultancy, and started and ran his own business. These days, Dr. Adrian finds himself in university administration, playing the role of gadfly in challenging and reframing the fundamental assumptions of higher education in today's messy world. He hopes that perhaps his messy and meandering career will provide the sort of experience useful in navigating complexity. Last, and certainly not least on our panel, is Professor Gopinathan, often referred to as the father of education in Singapore. Professor Gopinathan is the academic advisor at the HED Foundation. Prior to joining the HED Foundation, he served as the Dean of the School of Education at the National Institute of Education, among other appointments at Nanyang Technological University. In 2003, Professor Gopi helped establish a Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice at the National Institute of Education. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our panelists will join us in responding to today's keynote address, which will be delivered by Professor Philip Orbach. Professor Philip Orbach is a research professor and distinguished fellow of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. He's a member of the Russian government's 5 to 100 University Excellence Commission, a member of the International Advisory Committee of the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, Russia, and the Graduate School of Shanghai Jiatong University. He was the 2004 to 2006 Distinguished School Leader of the Fulbright New Century Scholars Program. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Altbach will share with us his perspectives on the future of higher education in Southeast Asia, but taking into context where and how Southeast Asia has gotten to where it is today. What does the past tell us and help us inform the future? So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Philip Orbach to deliver his keynote address. Professor Orbach, please.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this important webinar. I'm sitting on the other side of the world. You people know what you're talking about. I'm not sure that I do, but what I will try to do is stimulate some thoughts for a discussion with our distinguished panelists. I want to do 4 things in 18 minutes, and that may be a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to try it. The first one is to say a little bit about higher education, research, and knowledge in Southeast Asia. The reason I say this is because my impression in general is that with few exceptions, and HESB is one of the important ones, maybe the most important one now, there is relatively little knowledge of higher education realities, developments, plans, challenges in the region as a whole. And I think it's exceedingly important that this kind of knowledge be built up. I don't know of any national research center, in Malaysia may be the one exception, in any of the Southeast Asian countries that is focusing on collecting data, knowledge, perspectives, plans on higher education. I think this is really, really important. Vignesh has mentioned that Southeast Asia as a region is really quite important and amazingly interesting. And for those of us not in the region, not all that well understood or known. I would also argue that despite some efforts in ASEAN and other related organizations, there's not that much that's known within the region about the other countries. Southeast Asian countries, I think, are largely focused, not surprisingly perhaps, on their own problems and issues. And the diversity of higher education realities in the region is immense. There is certainly one world-class university system in the region, Singapore. There is another one, Malaysia, which has tried hard and is maybe on the verge of becoming a comprehensive and impressive national higher education system. We have a huge country, the biggest in the region, Indonesia, with a big higher education establishment about which I believe very little is known, and it's hard to identify a key top-class, world-class research university. There are a number of other countries in the region, Vietnam and the Philippines, big countries which have made some important progress in higher education. And there are some very small countries. So tremendous diversity. And as Vignesh has pointed out, every religious tradition in the world. And I might point out, every colonial reality has been experienced, perhaps negatively, by Southeast Asia, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Americans, and even the Portuguese. The only one missing is the Germans. So it's a very interesting region. Language plays an important role in 21st century higher education development. And the approaches to language among the different countries in the region vary. And it's important, I think, to think through how language will play a role. What would be the role of the national languages in the different countries? What will be the role of the major global language of science, which of course is English and will continue to be English? We've seen in almost all the Southeast Asian countries the rise of an important, powerful, little understood private higher education sector. Some of it for profit, some of it not for profit, religiously focused. It's important to understand that private higher education development. And globally and within the region, it's not really very much understood. So we need to really focus on that. In my view, every country needs to have at least one research university. They don't necessarily need to be world-class. It would be hard to think how Laos, for example, could develop a world-class research university. But in my opinion, they need one. They need an institution that can function effectively in the global higher education environment. If they're not creating Nobel Prize winners, at least they're able to understand and deal with the knowledge that is created around the world by the Nobel Prize winners and by the major research university sectors. Relatively few countries in the region, in my view, at the moment, have that level of research university. And a question which maybe our panelists can take up is, what's the best way of doing that? And how can we get our governments to support that initiative? So the development of research universities, or at least one of them in each country, is important. And it would be really helpful to be able to get those research universities to function in a regional context that's meaningful. One has ASEAN, one has a couple of higher education consortia around the region, but again, very much as an outsider on the other side of the world, these efforts in terms of their actual policies and actual impact in the region and globally are pretty modest. And I think one has to recognize that and figure out ways to develop those systems. So these are a few comments about Southeast Asia. Let me move and really quickly to what I think are the major global trends really of the last half century or more that the region is experiencing, needs to understand, I think better than it does, and needs to cope with, because everyone goes through these developments. One of them, of course, is massification and its implications. All the world is seeing the expansion of higher education in a number of countries. European countries, North America, that massification has reached its upper limits. There probably won't be any more, with 60 to 85, 90% of young people going on to some aspect of post-secondary education. We've seen implications for quality of that massification, often a decline, frankly, in quality. We've seen tremendous expansion of opportunities for women, for minority groups and populations, for different socioeconomic classes. And that's been very impressive. We've seen the rise in most countries of the private sector with different implications. We've seen the growth still occurring of the middle class in different countries. And that group of people, rapidly expanding, is particularly interested in getting access to higher education. So we've seen massification. Southeast Asian countries are in different levels of that massification development. Some, Singapore, to some extent Malaysia, to some extent the Philippines, I think, are at fairly high levels of access. Others have a long way to go and are at an earlier stage of massification. The other part of the pattern of higher education development that we can see everywhere is the growth of the global knowledge economy. And what that means is that research universities, as I pointed out, become exceedingly important as institutions which educate. Notice I say educate and not train, which is so much part of the discussion these days. I still think education is what is most important. Training, yes, but education, how to think, how to write, how to be constructive in terms of new ideas is central to the educated person and to a university graduate particularly. So the global knowledge economy has stimulated the rise of elite universities, and they work in tandem. They're important. And countries which want to flourish in the global knowledge economy need to have these kinds of universities. Not all of them, but some of them. Countries need to have a differentiated, diversified academic system with different kinds of academic institutions serving different levels of the population, and relatively few countries all around the world, not just in Southeast Asia, but everywhere, have thought too little about how to plan for and develop an integrated post-secondary education system. I think one of the important successes of the American higher education experience in the last century or more is our development of an integrated higher education system that serves many different parts of the population with institutions that link up with each other. So these are the two elements. Part of the global knowledge economy, of course, is international mobility and internationalization. And Southeast Asia has had different approaches to that. Part of the global knowledge economy is, of course, the use of global English. And again, Southeast Asian countries have had different approaches to the role of English. And it would be interesting to hear how our panelists think that English can play a role. So let me say a few words about our current crisis, and I will conclude at that point. Mainly, I want to talk about what I call the 4 C's and these relate to internationalization, but they also relate broadly. And those 4 C's are COVID, what it's going to mean, climate, the climate crisis, China, and commercialization. And there's a lot to unpack, and I only have 3 minutes left, but I'll try to unpack it a little bit because I think it's important. The impact of the COVID crisis, I think, and I might well be wrong, will be less than many of the analysts are now saying, but it will be significant. And just to be very brief, and again, I would be really interested to hear the perspectives of our panelists. I think the COVID crisis has convinced us all that distance education, particularly in its hybrid model, can be, is now an important part of the delivery of post-secondary education. It is not my view, particularly at the upper levels, upper prestige and quality levels of higher education, that distance education is going to take over. I do think that we will be hybridized. There will be programs, degrees, courses, which are delivered partly by distance and partly on campus. I think the university of the coming 20, 30 years or more will look actually very much like the best universities and maybe some of the bad universities too that we see around the world even now. COVID will, as I said, increase the use of distance education, but the long-term impact, I think, will be relatively minimal. And again, I'd love to hear the perspectives of our panelists about that. Let me move on for just a couple of comments about climate. We all recognize there's a climate crisis. We all recognize we need to be concerned about sustainability. What is this going to mean? Probably it's going to mean a little less student and faculty mobility. Particularly, this is going to be an impact on the United States, where much of our outbound student mobility is for short term, few weeks, a month. And I think we're going to have to cut down on that to reduce the environmental impact. The climate crisis may increase mobility within Europe, where distances are shorter. I think it will impact international conferences and similar events. We have learned that webinars like this one can be effective and interesting. And I think it's going to have significant impact on what I would call the internationalization industry, some of which is for profit, and all of which is going to be affected. China. China is an increasingly important global higher education power, as well as an economic power, and political and military as well. It drives the American policymakers crazy at the moment. I would be interested to hear, but probably will not get too many frank opinions from our panelists and maybe from our participants in the role of China in higher education in the region. But I think it's important. And by the way, it always has been important. Chinese culture, Chinese language, Chinese religion have all been part of the Southeast Asian environment for centuries. So China is going to be important, not only in your region, but globally. China is now a major importer of students, as well as the world's biggest exporter of students. And to conclude, the last C is the commercialization of higher education in general, and particularly the commercialization of internationalization. And I think this is a particularly interesting question for Southeast Asia, because you have in your region a lot of international players starting branch campuses, engaging in joint degree programs, and so on. And I would argue that many of them, maybe most of them, are there for commercial reasons. They would like to make some money from you guys, and they've been pretty successful at that. And I think that the policymakers, the countries in the region, on both sides of the equation, need to fully understand the nature of that commercialization, how it works, and to whose benefit it is. Nothing wrong with it, so long as it's understood, controlled, and that the quality is maintained. So we have to think about internationalization not as a pure philanthropic good. I wish we could think that way, but we have to think of it realistically, and commercialization is very much part of it. So to conclude, the coming period is going to be one of significant change. There's no doubt about that, for the reasons I've mentioned and probably many others. That change is going to affect your region dramatically, because most of the countries in your region are still developing higher education systems. Those few countries, mainly I would argue Singapore and Malaysia, which have developed a reasonably effective system, are still affected very much by what's happening in the rest of the world. Are we going to see a revolution in higher education? I don't think so, but we are going to see change, and we are going to see increased competition for resources for our industry as countries have to deal with the economic impact of COVID, the economic and social impact of the climate crisis, and an increasingly complicated world. I hope, colleagues, that I've given our panelists something to think about and hopefully to disagree with, so that we can have a really good discussion. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Orbach, for that enlightening, insightful, and at times a little bit controversial, but I think our panelists are going to enjoy discussing the issues that you raised in our panel discussion that will follow. Ladies and gentlemen, before I invite our first panelist to share his response, I'd like to share with you a poll that we will be conducting during today's webinar. We'd like to know from you what you think would be the biggest challenges that HEIs, higher education institutions in Southeast Asia, will face today. Please make your vote as you see the poll appear in front of you. And once you're done, submit it, and I will share the findings of our poll, the results of our poll, at the end of this discussion. There's another quick point I'd like to raise, and I think many of you have already been using it. There is a Q&A function available at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask our panelists or our keynoters questions during the discussion, please type your questions into the Q&A box. I will raise these questions later on during our Q&A discussion. Please also vote for questions that you feel express the ideas that you would like to get answered. In the interest of time, I may not be able to raise all questions with our panelists, so the higher voted questions will get raised first. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite Professor Dato Morshidi to share his response to Professor Orbach's keynote address. Professor Morshidi, please.
Good morning to participants and fellow speakers, and good afternoon or good evening for our participants in other regions. Let me thank the organizer for this wonderful occasion to share my thoughts on the main themes of Prof. Altbach's keynote speech earlier on. I will not be taking off all the issues, all the items that have been raised by Prof. Alba. Probably I'll take 2 or 3 of those main issues within the time that is given to me. Firstly, on Prof's first item on ASEAN, it's quite a common knowledge among scholars in ASEAN that ministers of education or higher education, depending on which countries we're referring to, have been talking about a common higher education area similar to those that we have in the EU. But to me, it is not possible for us to have a common higher education area in the context of ASEAN. The nearest that you can have is a higher education common space within the context of ASEAN. This is particularly important in the context of, in many of the ASEAN countries, we have a situation where politics first and then education. Unless and until we are able to promote education first, then politics, it will not be possible for us to look at ASEAN in the terms that Prof. Altbach has mentioned as an area which promotes collaboration and cooperation in the context of higher education. Now, Prof. Altbach is right in mentioning we have a governmental organization that handles common higher education issues and items in the context of ASEAN. But again, because of the importance of politics and then education, we have not been in a position to push this agenda, a common higher education space in the context of higher education for ASEAN as a whole. So it is still an agenda to be pursued, or should I say it is an unfinished agenda within ASEAN. For the very reason that in ASEAN, we have a problem of continuity in policies and actions. Take some countries, for example. Today they have Ministry of Education. Tomorrow they spirited into Ministry of Education and Higher Education, and a few months down the road they merge again. So policies will be affected in that sense. There will be discontinuities in policies depending on who's leading the ministries. That is a peculiar problem within ASEAN in terms of continuity of policies. Now, the second issue is massification of higher education. In many countries in Southeast Asia, we see the rise of the private sector in line with the need for greater enrollment in higher education or tertiary education in response to massification. But then there is generally an issue of the quality of delivery, the quality of education because of massification. Now, in some countries in Southeast Asia, in response to massification, they are working on issues related to quality assurance. Now, Malaysia is a good example where we have developed a good system of quality assurance through some government agencies that have been dedicated for this purpose. And we have been, over the years, sharing our experiences with other countries within ASEAN in terms of qualification, accreditation, quality assurance in general, and so on and so forth. And in some countries, we have been training them for quite a number of years in quality assurance mechanism and so on and so forth. But in many of these countries, they have not been in the position to come up with a recognized quality assurance system, even though they have been eager to improve their quality assurance in view of massification. So Prof. Altbach is right because of the different levels of development in higher education in the context of ASEAN countries. The response to massification in terms of quality assurance has been very different too, from based on the level of development of higher education in those countries. So massification have led to quality assurance issues, and this has subsequently led to the lesser recognition or non-recognition of courses offered by institutions in those countries. Now, education viewed from the rise of the elite universities, research universities, for example, it's good that in those countries, such as Laos, Cambodia, Prof. Alba is mentioning that at least one universities could be elevated as a research universities. But that criteria of research universities are normally referred to or based on the criteria of research university in the Western context, which may create problems to many universities in ASEAN, which may not be familiar with the Western criteria of a research university. So there is an urgent need for ASEAN countries to develop their own criteria for research university in the context of the ASEAN region. It is not probably appropriate to aim the criteria that's been used by the Western countries to determine a research universities. And the last point that I'm taking up from Prof. Altbach's keynote speech is China. Yes, China is very important to many of the ASEAN countries. In the case of Malaysia, China is a major source of our international students, and we have a university, a branch campus, international campus of a Chinese university in Malaysia, which are doing well in terms of the need for internationalization in the Malaysian context. So China is very important as a market for international students in Malaysia. But the thing now is with COVID, international students coming to Malaysia may be affected primarily in the context of many of the countries such as China, such as other ASEAN countries. We are not in position to be in control of the imports or the inflow of international students in those countries, because with COVID, we realized that there are so many other agencies that are having their share in the development of higher education in Malaysia. Not only higher education ministry, we have other ministries that have put their stake on the development of education, whether you're opening the borders, whether we are allowed to open the universities, whether the universities are allowed to function as it used to be. So we have realized that with COVID, the Ministry of Higher Education has not the upper hand with respect to the internationalization of higher education. So while China is very important as a source of student inflows to Malaysia, there are other ministries that could determine whether we are allowed to receive students from China in the near future. In fact, whether we are allowed to receive students from any countries in the near future. So if we look at the current crisis, we realize that higher education ministry is not the only ministry that have taken, they are in full control of the development of higher education in Malaysia at the moment. With respect to the development of higher education in ASEAN as a whole, there is an urgent need for many of the countries in ASEAN, probably not Singapore, probably not Thailand, but at least Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, or even Malaysia, to rethink their trajectory of the development of their higher education system with less international students, with other intervention from ministries, other ministries, apart from Ministry of Education or Higher Education, in the development of higher education in the future. While online is very important, whether we are successful in implementing online depend on our internet accessibility. That is not within the Ministry of Higher Education or Education. It's within the other ministries. So we are highly dependent on the ministries in that sense. So those are my earlier points in response to Prof. Albach's keynote speech. Probably we can go into some details on this point later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Moshidi. I think you helped put a lot of Dr. Orbach's points into its right context in the Southeast Asian setting, and also share some of your perspectives and your experiences in Malaysia's higher education system. I'd now like to invite Dr. Adrian Kwah from the National University of Singapore's Futures Office to share his perspectives. Singapore, as Professor Orbach had stated in his keynote, is a bit of an outlier in Southeast Asia. But is that necessarily a good thing? Is that a great thing? And does Singapore have a role to play in the development of higher education in Southeast Asia? Dr. Adrian, your perspectives, please.
So, hello everyone. First of all, thanks Vignesh, thanks to the HED Foundation for inviting me to be part of this webinar. Thanks to Professor Orbach for scintillating overview of the issues. One of the pitfalls of not being the first respondent, of course, is that everything that I wanted to say, the good Datu has already said it for me. So as he made his comments, I found myself crossing off a whole bunch of things off my list. Nevertheless, I think I do still have a few points that I would like to make. So, working in the Futures Office, and my job as the get is to try to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And I found that the former is actually easier to do because, after all, we are inundated by new ideas all the time, right? All our conversations are dominated by talk of disruption and innovations and developments and so forth, right? And we naturally gravitate to all these new things, right? Driven by a new mania of sorts. So for us working in higher education, especially, notions of artificial intelligence and hybridization of classes and education technology, all these things come very easily and naturally to us. I find that the latter is actually harder to do because we are talking about the fundamental assumptions and worldviews that shape this world we occupy, this world of higher education. And this is really the air we breathe. We tend to not to think very much of them. We take them as received wisdom. These are, of course, the beliefs that have become very familiar over time. And with familiarity comes with it this assumption that these things don't change, right? They're immutable. The different institutions of higher education will remain more or less the same. The university is eternal, so to speak. So in trying to imagine or reimagine the future of higher education, I think the first thing we need to do is to mitigate the excesses of our technocratic instincts. And I say this especially from the Singapore context because we are rather good at all things technocratic, and I use technocracy not in the rocketry manner, but really speaking to an expertise in solving technical issues. But perhaps we've gone a little bit too far because while university administrators and leaders worldwide have gotten very good at the how of things, perhaps comparatively we have tended to neglect the why of things. And this is unavoidable given the busyness of our days as uh, administrators and education leaders. But so I think one of the things that we do need to ask ourselves, and this is to build on Professor Orbach's keynote address, is we need to ask ourselves, why would students of the future want to avail themselves of higher education as it is currently conceived and delivered? And of course, we have to bear in mind that this space of higher education is a diverse and fragmented place, uh, and perhaps likely to be even more so in the years to come. So Professor Orbach talked about massification. And I would add on to say that not only is there a limit to massification, we may well see a reverse trend of demassification. And what would it mean for universities that continue to assume that uh, growth is linear uh, and predictable? So when you have demassification juxtaposed against a trend of deglobalization, how would that landscape look to us in years to come? Now, coming back to Southeast Asia, which is the focus of this webinar, I think that especially in our region, higher education has, to varying degrees, been in service to the economic imperative. It has served the developmental agenda, variously defined, since in the post-Second World War period, where the material challenges of life were real and profound. But again, have we taken the economic imperative too far? Are we now able to look beyond the economic imperative at the broader suite of issues that our future students might be seized with, such as climate change, questions of identity, social justice, and so forth? And what form might higher education take in a world where we are now finally having to confront the very real planetary resource constraints that's starting to push against the very familiar social, political, and ideological frames of reference within which higher education operates? Right? So, one dominant metaphor of higher education is that we are a factory, whether we are a university, a polytechnic, a vocational institute. The image that comes to mind, and which has been dominant for a good many years, especially in this part of the world, is that it is a factory. We produce economic agents that will fit into industry. And so I think policymakers and education leaders in this part of the world expend a lot of effort worrying about whether our students, our products, are going to be fit for purpose, for employers, for employment. How soon can they get a job? What's their starting salary going to be like? If they get retrenched, how soon before they get another job? Have we trained them well enough so that they are employable their whole lives? But I think that's only a sliver of it as we move into the future, because in interacting with young people, and to be fair, the not so young people, my generation and beyond, that economic imperative is also starting to get questioned, right? Surely it is not the sole purpose of a higher education institute to produce economic agents, but whole human beings better able to navigate this world of complexity, contestation, ambiguity, and all the other stuff that we read about in the news. So this also brings us to a suite of broader questions, which I hope my colleagues on the panel can also consider. I'd love to hear from the participants what they think about it. Does higher education merely reflect society? Right? Does it reproduce it? Or are we actually in a position to transform it ideally for the better? I think related also to the question of why would students want to avail themselves of higher education in the future, especially as the world becomes more complex. We need to also look at this question of disciplinarity. What does disciplinarity, right, which is the organizing principle of most universities and in fact polytechnics as well, what does disciplinarity mean in a world of complexity that really just mocks at your disciplinary boundaries? And just to very quickly respond to 2 points, 2 of the C's that Professor Orbach raised. When we talk about COVID-19, it's also very conventional to talk about a post-COVID world. Perhaps that's a very bold assumption to make. Perhaps all we can ever talk about is a late COVID world, and how are we to continue to operate in such a world of perpetual social distancing, the loss of intimacy in our classrooms, since there are no classrooms, physical classrooms to go to. And especially for a global university, how are you to be global if there's no globe to be global in? And as to China, right, university leaders, education policy makers have always tended to focus on technical and technocratic issues. If we are now to operate in a space where we're buffeted by superpowers, what kind of savvy do we need to develop in order to accommodate, right, the whims and fancies of these great powers? So I think I'll stop there, having muddied the waters enough. So just gonna hand it back to Vignesh.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you very much. I don't think you muddied any of the waters. If anything, you filtered some of it and helped us see more clearly. I think there's some very interesting points that Adrian has raised. I think the idea that we may never live in a post-COVID world, but a late COVID world, it's both very real, but at the same time, rather depressing to think about. But that might be the case. As we were planning this webinar, we were thinking that this would be a time where COVID would not be top of mind. The world is moving towards vaccinations. Things looked better. And even here in Singapore, things are not getting that, to that level that we assumed. Just today, we heard about a nurse that's unfortunately been stricken with COVID, despite having had both vaccination shots. So, and what's happening in India is distressing, to say the least. So, yeah, maybe COVID, we're never really going to move to a post-COVID world, but a late COVID world. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've saved the best for last. And I hope Prof. Gopi doesn't say that everything he wanted to say, both Adrian and Professor Moshidi had shared, because I'm sure Prof. Gopi, with his wealth of experience in not just higher education, but even in education, would have a lot to share about his perspectives. So Professor Gopi, over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on to this webinar, and also to the participants. A warm welcome. Thank you, Phil, for a very comprehensive keynote. You touched all the points, and the 2 panelists as well. It is true. I mean, they have said everything I wanted to say, but that's no excuse. I will say something still. One of the things that strikes me is that we should also keep in mind the wider context, a little bit of history. If we think about it, if you think about, say, 2.5 decades from where we are now, this was going to be the period of massification, not just in higher education. This is a period of massification in the whole education system in a large number of countries. So a key policy priority was paying attention to access to education, quality to education, to try and guarantee at least 10 years of education, if not 12 years of education. So fundamentally, we are now at a stage when I think we are going to be able to see a takeoff, an era of growth and development in higher education, with all its possibilities and all its challenges. And I say this because 40 years ago, I was extremely fortunate to be able to find Phil Altbach in Buffalo and asked to be able to study with him. And I think even at that time, I was probably the first person in Singapore, 1, to do research on higher education, and B, to do comparative higher education research. And I say this because if we fast forward to where we are now, I do not see, as Phil has pointed out, a great amount of research on higher education. It does not seem to have had the priority that it needs to have, even though this is the era of massification in higher education, and a large number of graduates on the K-12 system are looking forward now to move on to further certification, because economic growth in Southeast Asia is now at a stage where countries are looking at moving away from a sort of middle income status into a high income countries. And if it's going to be a high income countries, and that's the aspiration of many economies in the Southeast Asian region, then it's going to be a highly aspirational society. So the demand for higher education will be there. The demand for higher education has got to be met. The demand for higher education will lead to massification, but will lead to issues with quality. What are we going to do about it? And we don't have, as Phil pointed out, enough of the research. We cannot expect policymakers to do research. So one of the fundamental issues I think we have going forward for Southeast Asia, what are the models that are most appropriate to an Indonesia, to a Philippines, to Laos or Cambodia? So Phil's point about diversity in a historical sense, but diversity also now is, I think, a very pertinent point. So I think what we need to be thinking about is where are we now in a sense, in my view, a sort of unbridled growth of higher education. Where are we now and where are we to go if we fast forward another 10 years, another 20 years? It seems to me that there is much diversity, as Phil pointed out, but also much to learn from each other. We tend to position sort of Singapore as the leader in the pack, and in some ways it is the leader in the pack. But again, if you're a Singaporean, if you thought of higher education, for a very long time, we had 2 universities, and then they collapsed into 1 university, and now we have 6 universities. And the 6 universities is a very recent growth in the Singapore education system. Today in Singapore, we are talking about multidisciplinarity. What would that, we're talking about curricular change. And for me, sitting in Singapore, having a background in higher education, I'm amazed at the sort of policy initiatives that are coming out almost on a month-by-month basis. So there's a lot of churn going on. Part of it related to COVID and late COVID and what are we going to do about it. Concerns over the relevance and the quality, even in Singapore, of the type of education, the graduate programs that are being provided. And I think that's going to be something that if Singapore has, in the sort of ecology, in the sort of administrative capacity it has, worries about this, how much more is it going to impact? So I think there are opportunities for researchers in higher education to research it, and my wish is that they will take this on. Secondly, I think collaboration. We are different, but we are similar in some ways. And there's going to be opportunities to collaborate. As I said earlier, I don't think there is the degree of collaboration that is needed. There is RIHED, there is ASAHIL, there is UNESCO, there are any number of organizations. But one needs to ask, what is the future for collaboration? And that touches on the point of mobility. We very often talk, when we talk of mobility in higher education, about student mobility. But what about faculty mobility? How much was that cross-disciplinary research? We are conscious that with COVID now, with climate change previously, that what happens in one country impacts on another country. So climate change, for example, sustainability, for example, are huge items on the agenda, of the research agenda. But what steps are being taken to see what might be ways in which faculty might not only just do disciplinary research, multidisciplinary research within their own countries, but across countries in Southeast Asia? What would facilitate that? What would be the role of organizations like RIHED or big, capable, well-resourced countries like Singapore? So I think there are both challenges at the present time. There are also possibilities at the present time. And I think the time is right now to ask ourselves, as a region, with all its diversity, with all its possibilities, going forward, if we are going to be what Phil said and what others have said about ASEAN being a huge economic superpower, it cannot be that if it doesn't have higher education central to that view of Singapore, a view of ASEAN going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Gopi. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now move towards our panel discussion part of today's conversation. I've been looking through the Q&A section and I see some very, very interesting questions, and I will raise them to our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, before I do that, I just have to issue a preemptive apology. If I mispronounce any of your names, I'm really sorry for that. But I'll do my best to read out the questions as they are presented, but I may abridge them in the interest of time. Before I take questions from the floor, I'd like to pose the first question as the moderator's privilege and to ask our panelists. What intrigued me, I think, was when Professor Orbach mentioned about education versus training. I think that tension, that sort of contrast between the purpose of a university, is it there to provide an education or is it there to train? Now, if we look at the developments across Southeast Asia, it seems like we are making that move towards universities playing a larger role to train. In Singapore, we have conversations around skills future, continual learning, and it's very skill-centric, right? We're there to train them because we need, as Adrian mentioned, economic agents that would fit into the system, that would be able to provide. Now, how do we contrast that with education? I mean, we also at the same time in Singapore are exploring and have developed multidisciplinary courses. We have liberal arts colleges, which are new to our system. So is it possible that maybe this distinction between the idea of training and education might result in a sort of rift between what we see traditionally as a university, that there will be a certain sliver of a university that looks to educate within the system, that provides its students with the broad and diverse education, whilst a large segment of the university will still be focused on training, on providing individuals with the skills needed to ensure a country's economic prosperity and growth. And keeping in mind, of course, the unique circumstance that ASEAN finds itself in, both in terms of its political systems across the region and also the economic development that the region has been experiencing in the last few years and is planning and predicting for in the future. So I would love to hear the perspectives from our panelists before we take questions from the floor.
Can I start out with a reaction to your very important points? First of all, as I mentioned in my talk, higher education systems are diverse, and there will always be, and in my view, this may sound a little bit elitist, there are going to be top-level research-oriented universities, and those universities are going to provide education as well as some training. So that's important. My argument also is that all aspects of a higher education system, even those which are more in the business of training for jobs in society, need to provide some aspects of what we in the States call liberal arts, even if the balance is much more vocational. And indeed, the balance is becoming more vocational even at top-level institutions. And I think you find that in Singapore. You find that not exclusively, but much, to a great extent in the US. So I think we need to keep education front and center, education in the traditional sense. And many of the commentators in my country and globally, in my view, forget about that. I think it's a big problem. On the other hand, most of the students, all of the students who come through our institutions will need to get jobs and professions in a rapidly changing environment, impacted by AI and all kinds of other things, which us oldies sort of can't wrap our minds around for the most part. But I think In response to Vignesh, and again, I'd be interested in our panel reactions. Both are important. We tend to a little bit ignore the education part.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Orbach. And from our panelists, we have some response or reaction. Maybe Professor Moshidi or Professor Gopi, you have something to share?
No, Moshidi, go ahead.
Thank you, Vignesh. I believe in a system that focuses on education plus training. Please bear in mind that I said plus training. Training could be not specific to certain industry, not specific to certain factory, but training in terms of the thinking skill that is required for them to do well in education. Right now we have education, but graduates lack the thinking skill that is required for them to move on based on the education. So that's the very reason I say it's not either education or training, it's education plus training, which is specific to the skill required in the future. And that skill could be high-level thinking skills, qualitative, quantitative skills that requires a more diverse approaches in the environment. So that is my approach to education and training kind of issues argument. Yeah, it's not either one. It has to be both. But as Prof. Albach mentioned, it cannot be the other way around. It cannot be training plus education. It has to be education plus training. Okay, that's from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moshidi. Prof. Gopi?
Yes, I think it's an important point, but I'm not sure what the right answer is. Perhaps if we thought, Singapore seems to be thinking in terms of post-secondary education rather than education as such, so that we have, and maybe because we are small, we have an ecology of different types of institutions, which might prioritize one or the other, but not exclude one or the other. So Singapore has built up also a network of polytechnics and ITE, which are largely skilled forces, but not exclusively so. The universities have been a little late to the game, and they are now building up the capacity to think more about what sorts of programs. And this is not just Singapore, this is not ASEAN. I think globally, ministries which have to fund higher education, which have to resource higher education, are very preoccupied with the issue of job loss. Those of us in K-12 think in terms of learning loss. What those people who are thinking post of that is job losses. And that's a reality because if you invest in institutions like universities and you graduate, what utility? I'm not saying that's the only question, but it is a question that policymakers will ask. It is a question that economists will ask. So how do we, moving forward, not privilege one over the other? How do we find a balance? Does that mean differentiated universities, but within differentiated institutions, but within these institutions, some way? Because I think going forward, if we can, those of us in higher education, make the point that both sets of skills as well as capacity for thinking out of the box, for continual learning, for lifelong learning, for ability to problem solve, these are both going to be economically valuable skills. We cannot get away, I think, from the fact that the economy, I mean, look at the debates in America at the moment about opening up or not opening up. A lot of this has to do with the economy. And so policymakers are caught, and I hope that moving forward, we can have a dialogue, a conversation on how to meet this particular point in time with COVID and the late COVID phenomenon.
Adrian, would you like to add your perspectives to the topic?
Yeah, I think Prof. Gopi really nailed it when he said that it's about balance. I think we are too quick to contrive an either or kind of trade-off and either or kind of dichotomy. And of course, education is important, right? And all the things that we come to associate with higher education, the expansion of horizons, the development of the whole person, all these things matter. But at the same time, the material world intrudes. And of course, we hope that our students are able to go out into the world, get a job that's fulfilling, that pays the bills, and allows them to do whatever it is that they want to do in life. And it ought not to be either or. And I think we are too quick to paint that very to posit a very convenient trade-off where we decide it's one or the other. So I think thanks to Professor Gopinathan for raising that. I would just want to zoom in on this whole notion of skills, right? With Industry 4.0 and all the changes that are coming fast and furious, you see the different entities in this world of higher education are responding in very interesting ways. At the risk of being facetious, you see, for example, you might see polytechnics responding by trying to be university-like. At the same time, universities respond by becoming a polytechnic on steroids. And so neither is kind of where they want to be, and they're each trying to emulate the other. And perhaps a blend of both is needed, which also means the way we segment that world becomes very problematic. And I guess the next thing the final thing I would say is that when we say skill, and skills is all the rage, the word skill dominates policy discourse in Singapore. We've got the skills future national movement. It's familiar to all Singaporeans or all who are everybody who's involved in education. Do we really know what a skill is, right? And when a polytechnic teaches a skill, or a private sector organization teaches a skill, and a university teaches a skill, does the word skill mean the same thing, or are they different in different contexts? Perhaps universities are teaching meta-level skills, right? All the things that we say are much needed in this brave new world, like critical thinking, imagination, creativity, etc. Can these things actually be taught, given how universities are currently configured? So maybe, again, just for my colleagues to consider and to hear from the audience as well, from the participants.
Thank you, Adrian. And members of the audience, if you would like to share your perspectives, please put them in our Q&A chat box. Now, as I move on to some of the questions from the floor, I think the first question, the highest voted question from Deepak, I think this is a very interesting question, and it expounds a little bit on what we had just been discussing. Deepak asks, how would you propose to find resources for setting up research universities when mindsets are set on economic developments and commercialization and downplaying of fundamental research? Prof. Gopi, you helped set up a research institute in NIE during your time. Would you like to share, how do you convince policymakers, decision makers to put money aside when the focus very often is about economic development, the commercialization of research, when fundamental research may not necessarily bring and be as attractive to these decision makers?
Well, my own experience was with regard to teacher education, and we were at that point in time looking at how to reposition teacher education as an evidence-based profession, as opposed to a teacher education model, which is basically was skills oriented. This is how you manage a class. This is how you do a lesson plan. This is how you use the computers. So the shift was going to be about what do we understand education is about? What do the foundations of education mean, and why are they important? So, but we also discovered that we did not have a comprehensive and nuanced research base about how Singapore teachers at the beginning of this decade were teaching. And so the huge investment in pedagogic research, and we had actually to build the database, and I'm glad that today Singapore has a very detailed, nuanced research base on which to build professional development programs, on which to build initial teacher training programs. So I think that sort of research is important. But again, the duality between fundamental research and applied research, where does one draw the line, and how sharp does that line got to be? A lot of people now recognize that fundamental research is a sort of base on which economically valuable research might come out. So again, I think it's a case of balance. But I think we need to have these conversations, which I don't think we are having. My own feeling is that we have a fantastic research base in NIE on Singapore teaching and learning. But I have my doubts of how many of educators in Singapore draw from this space, how well it is known regionally, how well it is known internationally. So there's also this phenomenon that you may be able, after 2 decades, build up a research base, whether it's fundamental research or applied research. How do we get it out? And in the context of higher education, this is what I like to put in a plug for HESB. We need this sort of thing because we are at the very beginning stages of even sharing what we know and what we have.
Can I make?
Thank you. Yes, please, Prof.
Can I make a comment going back to the question asked by our participant? It's not an, in today's world, it's not an easy argument to make that a research university in the traditional sense is something worth spending your money on. I have to say, however, that as was mentioned in the intro, I'm a member of the Russian government's Excellence Commission. And one of the ways that that commission sold the idea of improving, there are 28 Russian universities that are part of our system, was to get them recognized in the rankings. And I'm very critical of rankings, very, very critical. Nonetheless, it's concentrated the mind of the Russian Ministry of Science and Education and has pried loose over the last 7 years about $3 billion worth of resources which they've invested. The point is, maybe the argument is, if a country wants to be part of this global knowledge economy, you have to have some research capacity. Doesn't mean you're going to need to do a lot of original research. It means you have to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. I think that's a slightly easier sell, but I'm thinking, what would I say to the Minister of Education in Laos that has lots of problems of his or her own that, to make that point? And to Adrian's point also, the COVID crisis puts another, financial stresses, intellectual stresses, and so on this whole argument. So it's not easy, but it's important. And, Gopi's case is a really good one of how a knowledge base, has been useful for the development, in his instance, of good teacher training in his country.
Thank you, Professor Orbach. Professor Moshidi and Dr. Adrian, would you like to share your perspectives on this issue before we move to the next topic?
A very short one. I quite agree with what Prof. Altbach mentioned. Research universities were very much aligned to the idea of reputation, image, and ranking. Unless and until we move into the real essence of research for knowledge rather than research for reputation, then it will not be possible for countries like Laos, Cambodia. Research for ranking is totally out of the question. It has to be research for the knowledge base that they have to build on for capacity building. Thank you.
Yeah.
Adrian, coming from one of the best ranked universities in the world.
I think I really kind of touched on this question of disciplinarity and the kind of the dysfunction that's developing because the wicked problems that we're having to confront and address, like climate change and poverty and so forth, defy single disciplinary approaches. And yet academia is predicated on single disciplines. You're trained in single disciplines, you're promoted on the basis of excellence in single disciplines. And by the way, funding tends to come in the way of funding single disciplinary research. So until these aspects of academia change, I'm afraid we're going to be stuck very much in a previous mode of working that might have been appropriate to a previous world, but certainly not in this one. I just also want to say that not only we also draw a dichotomy between theory and practice, right? And I think also given the austerity that's come about because of COVID-19, all the pressure is on translational research, on applied research. But we also need to stop a minute and think, when we say applied, what do we think we are really applying? Someone's basic research. So it's not an either or thing again, right? It's a dance. It requires both. For every practitioner who looks with disdain on a theorist, right? Stop and think, what do you think it is you're putting into practice? Someone's theory. And for every theorist out there, unless your theories are tested by way of practice, it's just magical thinking. So it's not either or, you need both.
Yeah.
It seems the more we discuss, the more false dichotomies we seem to reveal.
Yeah, but they're convenient in a way, right?
Yes, they are. They're easy for us to shoehorn into, right? And then create these challenges which do not necessarily have to exist. I want to touch on another topic, and I think we've talked a lot about research universities and the importance, as Professor Orbach had mentioned in his opening, about countries having research universities. And I think we then talked about rankings, and often research universities are often seen in the same light as the rankings, right? They should be well ranked within their countries, they should be highly ranked. And ranking is often defined today by publications. So there's a question from Dr. Prasad, and together with questions from a few other of our members of the audience, I think one of the issues here, and Dr. Prasad has put it quite well, you see, research is definitely important. It has to be focused on local and regional issues, impact on demographic, health, agricultural, social issues, etc. But these are not publishable. And that's his argument here, that many of the times the research in this region on issues that affect countries such as Laos and Myanmar, local issues that affect them, they're not publishable in international peer-reviewed journal. And therefore, these universities would not rise up the rankings, and the emphasis on research and them as developing as research universities will struggle. Professor Moshidi, in his presentation, also touched a little bit about an ASEAN definition, an ASEAN criteria for what a research university is that may be different from the Western definition. So could we discuss that a little bit? Could we discuss what would a research university look like, particularly in developing Southeast Asia, in places like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia? What is a research university going to look like? And how do we measure and how do we understand that these are fundamental and important research universities in their countries?
Yeah. Can I start out? Because I think we probably all have some things to say about that, and I'll try to be really brief. The first thing I would say is, I brought up the issue of rankings. Forget about the rankings. I mean, in the Southeast Asian context, for almost all the countries, it's meaningless for the reasons that Dr. Prasad, if I have the name right, and you, Vignesh, mentioned. So that's the first point. The second point is, I might disagree a little bit with Moshidi in the sense that I'm not sure there is a Southeast Asian research university new definition, just as there is a lot of discussion in the broader literature about universities with Chinese characteristics. In my view, what is the Chinese, again, I may get in trouble for this. In my view, the Chinese characteristic at the moment is difficult access to global knowledge, no academic or little academic freedom, and restrictions on what professors and students can do and say. Those are not good values, in my opinion. In my opinion, research universities are research universities. They can be different in the sense that in smaller countries that have been mentioned, there'll be more, as I've said also, there'll be more institutions which are looking to use creatively the knowledge that's created around the world and apply it to local circumstances. And no, you will not be able to publish in peer-reviewed journals of that, but that's fine. So we need to figure out ways of recognizing the different kinds of research which is done in the way that Professor Gopinathan described, for that little area of teacher education. But the same thing is true, for other areas of scientific development. And Adrian's point about interdisciplinarity, if you're talking about agriculture or sustainability or anything, all of this is interdisciplinary now. So it's a challenge for universities in developing small countries to sort of think through all this, but it's the reality and it's not rocket science.
Right. Can I come in? It's a challenge to put forward an idea where Philip Altbach disagree. It's very interesting in that. Thank you for that. But to me, when you have research and you're looking at the impact and outcome of this research in the view, in the context of an Anglo-Western journal, then you have problems, right? But if you look at research universities within ASEAN, but impact and outcome and publication within the context of the ASEAN journal are considered as part of that kind of recognition. That is what I meant by the ASEAN research, not based on any Anglo-American or British or whatever journals. That we will be losing out. And we sideline the ASEAN journal, which are specifically geared towards whatever research knowledge within the ASEAN context. That is what I meant by research universities in the context of ASEAN, bringing out the ASEAN journal to that level, not putting them down in comparison to what we have in the Anglo-Western context journal.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that point, but I think we still have a long way to go. Again, personal experience. We have in the NIE built up an education journal that I think is one of the best in Asia, the Asia Pacific Journal of Education. I find it very difficult to get a book review done on a book that has been published by Routledge on Singapore education. So there is this, we want to build up journals, we want to build up these things which are globally recognized, are significant for citations, and yet for some reason, globalization or internationalization seems to be, the more we have from outside Singapore, outside a particular country, the more international the journal is. Even though something that is from Singapore may have international significance. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
We need to get our mindsets changed on a number of ways to think about this issue of what research, valuable research, internationally relevant research is going to mean.
I also have been told, in the interest of time, that we have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to try to bring together a few questions that were asked by a couple of our panelists, a couple of our audience members that I think are a bit interesting, and they kind of ask a similar question. I think in our discussions today, we have presented the idea that a world-class university is important in the region, and actually important in every single one, as Professor Orbach shared in his keynote, in every single one of Southeast Asia's countries. The question that was being asked, and has been asked in different forms by different of the speakers, is it really that important in Southeast Asia, in a region that is developing, that is grappling, in many of the countries, grappling with basic economic challenges? They're grappling with basic challenges of education, about quality, about access, about discrimination against certain groups. Is it really that important that these countries be thinking about establishing world-class universities? Or should these countries be more centric about providing education, providing opportunities for its graduates, for its students, for its people, and also working more closely and in integration with other ASEAN countries, other Southeast Asian countries? So really the question is it that important to have world-class universities across Southeast Asia?
Can I, since I brought up the topic, let me try to be really, really brief. I didn't say world class. I said research universities. And Laos, to pick an example, is not going to have a world-class university regardless. But it my argument, with which some may disagree, is that all countries need to be able to engage with the global knowledge economy, even if they're not quite there yet. So there needs to be research capacity, and a country needs to, even a poor country, needs to do both. They have to worry about access at the bottom for large numbers of people who want to go to post-secondary education and need skills, and I would argue education as well. But you also have to have at least a little bit at the top. You have to be able to think both ways, and you have to be able to invest a little both ways.
Other panelists like to add to Professor Orbach's response? Okay, then in that case, I think I'm going to invite our panelists to make very quick closing remarks before we wrap up today's session. So maybe we'll start in a reverse order. So Professor Gopi, would you like to make your quick closing remarks?
No, I'd like to, first of all, on behalf of the foundation, thank the panelists and Professor Orbach in particular for what I think has been an exploration of some of the issues and dilemmas we face at this particular time. These are very challenging times, but I like to think that these are also circumstances which will spur innovation, which will spur thinking. My one wish would be that a lot of participants will have come from Southeast Asia, would have heard of this seminar, and would think, especially those in universities, how to better collaborate, to better share, and to build up the strength collectively, because as Phil pointed out, many countries cannot invest sufficiently for something that might be a research university, but it is necessary, and collaboration has got to be the way forward. Thank you.
Sorry. Adrian, would you like to make your quick closing remarks, please?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank the HED Foundation for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I certainly learned a lot. I just want to end with this notion of complexity. It's a word, again, we use all the time to describe all that we see and experience in the world today, and this is complex, and that is complex, and so forth. One of the insights from complexity is that sometimes the problem contains the seeds of its own solution, if only you would let it emerge. I think at a meta abstract level, it may be there may be some degree of conceit that if there are problems that policymaker or the educator is going to solve it, instead of creating space for the solution to emerge. So I just want to remind everybody that the root of the word school, and of course the university is a school of sorts, is schola, which means, translated, it means free time, open space. And so we should, in as much as dealing with the demands of industry and producing work-ready graduates, we should also maintain that space for reflection, for rumination, and for solutions, right? Answers to emerge of their own volition.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Professor Morshidi?
Okay, in the context of ASEAN, I'm looking forward to more collaboration and cooperation within universities, between universities in ASEAN. But the problem now is we have a situation where top-rated universities in ASEAN are working among themselves, and we tend to leave behind those universities within ASEAN that are at the bottom rank. But the issue is here. We have governmental organization within ASEAN that's supposed to deal with this, but they require a middle person, a middle agency from the European Union to come in our context and to bring our universities together in ASEAN rather than within ASEAN itself. This is a shame, I think. we need a third party from outside to come to ASEAN in order to bring collaboration together for universities within ASEAN. Post-COVID, we need to have more collaboration within ASEAN without the need to bring in third party from Europe or whatever. But they said we need a third party to bring in the money. That's another issue.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moshidi. I think your perspective of bringing ASEAN together is very important. I do think some of our friends from that third party are listening and joined us for today's discussion. But we do appreciate it. I hope the HED Foundation can continue to play that role, occasionally helping to bring together some of our friends across ASEAN to further think about research and ponder on some of these challenging issues. Well, last but certainly not least, I'd like to invite Professor Orbach to make his closing remarks. Professor Alba, please.
Well, I think they've all been made. I just want to thank the HED Foundation and underline once more both the issue that all of our panelists have mentioned about collaboration and cooperation within the region. Point one. Point two, the point that Professor Gopinathan made and I made also, the need for knowledge about our little industry, higher education. And I think that the contribution of the HED Foundation and particularly HESB, which we're celebrating with the seminar, has made a very important contribution to this. And I hope it can continue. So, and again, thank you very much. And I think this has been a really thought-provoking, for me, evening, for you, morning.
Thank you very much, Professor Orbach. I think many of you have stayed through the session because our speakers have been engaging and the topics have been interesting, but some of you might want to know the results of the poll. So could I have my colleagues please share the results of our poll, which we can share with our audience? Yes, so it seems curriculum relevance in a fast-changing economy is what most of you believe to be a pressing challenge for higher education institutes in the region. But that's not to say that others certainly are not pressing challenges too. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there have been a lot of fantastic questions asked in the chat, and unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're not able to answer many of them. HESB, as a publication, would be a great platform for us to discuss and unpack some of these issues. And I invite those of you who are tuning in today to our webinar to reach out to us at info@hedfoundation.org. If you'd like to explore some of the topics that you had highlighted in the Q&A and like to discuss some of this through our publications, we can have a conversation, and if suitable, we can look to publish some of these articles and topics. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we had a very insightful discussion today about the future of higher education in our region in Southeast Asia. Certainly, collaboration is necessary, and if ASEAN were to continue to remain relevant and was to increase its presence in the global stage to become even more important, collaboration across ASEAN member and Southeast Asian countries is very important. And that collaboration must come from the higher education institutions. Higher education often is seen as a harbinger of the future, but many a times in Southeast Asia, higher education institutions are the followers. They are not always leading. So maybe it's time that a lot of our higher education institutions come together, realizing the importance of collaboration across Southeast Asia. And as Dr. Moshidi pointed out in his closing remark, it's not about the top-ranking universities only working with the top-ranking universities. We have to come together to collaborate and to work together, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. So we have to come together, we have to work together across ASEAN if we want to see the region remain relevant, remain important, and not just a key driver of the economic growth of the coming century, but also of the academic development and the thought leadership that will shape the future of this world. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in today's webinar session. I hope you have found it to be as interesting and as insightful as I did. Please do visit our website, download a copy of our latest issue of HESB, and do reach out to us if you have ideas and suggestions about our publications, or if you'd like to reach out to us about our various other activities, including our capacity building programs. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and it has been a true pleasure to moderate today's session. I hope to be able to reach out to you and to connect with you in future sessions.